Pizza and Politics of the semester. My name is Ashley Weissmiller, and I'm the Pizza and Politics Coordinator at the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics. We are joined today by KU Law Professor Virginia Harper Ho for a conversation about all things Hong Kong. Before we get started, I want to mention that today's program is made possible by the generosity of Senator Nancy Kassebaum, who asked that her 2016 Dole Leadership Prize be used in support of student programs. We also want to give a special thank you to Toppers Pizza, who's donating free pizza coupons for a drawing at the end of all of our programs. If you are a student and tuning in live, please be sure to type your name in the chat function to be entered. If you can't stay the whole time, please refer back to this archived video on our YouTube channel and watch the end when we announce the winner. Good luck. Now let's welcome our guest, Virginia Harper Ho. Virginia Harper Ho is the Associate Dean for International and Comparative Law and an Earl B. Schertz Research Professor of Law at the University of Kansas School of Law, where she also serves as the director of its Polzinelli Transactional Law Center. Her research focuses on the intersections of corporate governance, sustainability, and finance in both mainland China and the United States. She has written recently on corporate disclosure, comparative corporate governance, and China's green finance reforms, and is the author of Labor Dispute Resolution in China, Implications for Labor Rights and Legal Reform, published by UC Berkeley's Institute for East Asian Studies. Harper Ho is a fellow of the National Committee on USChina Relations Public Intellectuals Program and has served as a research fellow of the International Institute of Green Finance at the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing, China. Before entering academia, she spent nearly a decade representing global companies on foreign investment in China and other cross-border transactions. She received her JD cum laude from Harvard Law School and speaks Mandarin and Cantonese, the latter thanks to her extended family in Hong Kong. Well, thank you, Professor Ho, for joining us today. I'm so pleased you're able to join us. So why don't you briefly start out by telling us a bit about your upbringing and education before we dive in to our topic today.
Great, thank you, Ashley. It's such a pleasure to be here. I will say before I say a little bit more about myself that this is a very timely event. It's obviously a long time in the works. We had no idea that this week Hong Kong would be so much in the news. Perhaps some of you have seen that this past week, China's legislature issued an order that said that the Hong Kong legislature, if you're a representative to the legislature and are elected, you need to satisfy a patriotism test that resulted in 4 legislators being disqualified from serving in the legislature, as a result of which the entire block of 19 pro-democratic legislators that were serving in the Hong Kong legislature, or LegCo, just resigned on Wednesday, which prompted Thursday, yesterday, Britain to threaten sanctions against China for its alleged violation of the agreement between Britain and China relating to the status of Hong Kong. So we'll talk more about all of that. But just a little about my background. I actually started out as a double language major, including one of those being Chinese, and was very interested in studying China. I am now a corporate law scholar as well as a China scholar, and I've been studying China and China's legal reform since the 1990s, and have over the years spent about every year or so in Hong Kong while working on various research projects in the region. Rewinding to kind of undergrad, I was interested, like many of you perhaps, in just doing something international when I was a student. And for me, that journey actually started in Hong Kong. I first visited when I was just out of high school in the early 1990s. And after a month or so visiting Hong Kong and some of mainland China, I became really fascinated with the region, the languages, and the culture. And I decided I wanted to study Chinese, hence my language majors. Then I went back to Hong Kong again as an undergrad while I was en route to some internships in the mainland, and including with the US State Department. And then during law school in 2000, which was right on the eve of China's entry into the World Trade Organization, I was working at a law firm in Hong Kong. And then last but not least, I still have an extended family in Hong Kong, which has given me a chance to see firsthand how some of the history that we'll be talking about today has affected modern Hong Kong and its people. So look forward to talking with you.
Of course, awesome. Well, thank you for that background. Really appreciate it. I know I'm excited to learn a lot from you today. So very thrilled that you're joining us. So let's jump right in it. So can you explain the history of autonomous Hong Kong from mainland China?
Okay, so this, I warned Ashley, this might take me a while, but I'm going to rewind actually back to the 1800s, and that might seem a little strange, but for those in mainland China, including the central government, this history is very fresh. And sometimes I think they don't realize that those of us in the US tend to really not pay too much attention to what happened 200 years ago, but it's directly relevant to the question of the status of Hong Kong. So I hope you'll bear with me. First of all, for those of you who may not be familiar with where Hong Kong is, it actually has three parts. It's an amazing, very bicultural, multicultural city. It is actually attached to the mainland of China in the southeast corner, adjoining the southern province called Guangdong. It is composed of Hong Kong Island. Most of the pictures you may have seen of Hong Kong, or if you Google it really quick, you'll see a bunch of skyscrapers, looks just like New York, except with more water and mountains. That's Hong Kong Island. And Hong Kong Island originally was a central part of the US-China trade and Western China trade, including with Britain and other countries, back in the 1800s. It's what got us the tea for the Boston Tea Party, as a matter of fact. Anyway, in addition to Hong Kong Island, if you ever visit, there's a harbor called Victoria Harbor. And again, in all the pictures online, you'll see the waterfront there. Across the harbor, facing north, that's called Kowloon Peninsula. Great shopping district, lots of people there, really an amazing part of the city. And if you go farther north, it'll start to feel a little more rural because you're getting a little closer to mainland China. Now, rural is a relative term now, tons of skyscrapers still. But historically, that has been farmland or was farmland long ago. Anyway, that part, which is really the largest part of Hong Kong geographically, is called the New Territories. And this is relevant because in 1842, at the end of one of the first wars that Britain fought with the Qing dynasty, China's last dynasty, Hong Kong was ceded to the British, which won that war. It's called the First Opium War in 1842, and an international treaty was signed between Britain and the Chinese emperor. And that treaty again ceded Hong Kong, but specifically Hong Kong Island, to the British in perpetuity because they had lost the First Opium War. There was a second war that concluded in 1860, known as the Second Opium War. And at the end of that war, which the Qing also lost, Britain forced China to cede to it not only the island, but also Kowloon Peninsula. So the second piece of modern Hong Kong. At the same time, Britain negotiated the lease of the new territories of Hong Kong, that northern, more rural part, to the Chinese government. At that time, again, the Qing dynasty, for 99 years. That is important because the date started counting in 1898, and it was supposed to run for 99 years. And you'll realize that coincides with the handover of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty in 1997. But because, of course, by this time, Hong Kong was not three separate places, but one unified city, in the run-up to 1997, when that lease expired, Britain and China began negotiations about what was to come next and what would happen after that lease expired. So again, as I mentioned yesterday, Britain began announcing that it would consider sanctions against the PRC, the People's Republic of China, for breach of the agreement regarding that handover. That agreement was reached in 1984, and it's called the Sino-British Declaration. And the point of it was to figure out what are going to be the terms under which Hong Kong would be governed after this lease expired. And it was recognized, I think, by the British as well, that there needed to be a resolution for all of the parts of Hong Kong. And the decision was made to have all of the territory of Hong Kong go back to Chinese sovereignty at that time, again in 1997. So I'm going to give you a couple details about the Sino-British Declaration because these are very much in controversy at the moment, in the sense that these were supposed to define the status of Hong Kong. And until frankly, only a couple months ago this week, I mean, we're all trying to figure out what does this all mean. I will say that in recent years, the current administration of China has taken steps and has announced that its view of this declaration was that it was only binding between 1984 and 1997. It was kind of a transition document. The British view is that this is a binding treaty that talks a lot about what happens after 1997 and is in fact still a binding treaty in force. And that's the point of the controversy right now. Anyway, what this declaration created was something that the world has never seen before. And at the time, and in fact, until really probably just this past year, most of us who know about this story have been very optimistic that the experiment that started in Hong Kong could be a model for other places in the region, and perhaps for other, conflict-ridden places around the world. What Hong Kong is governed by is something called one country, two systems. Again, it's something that's never been seen before. It also created a special governance district, a political subdivision that had never before existed in mainland China. So what the declaration said is that after 1997, Hong Kong would be considered a special administrative region. There's another one. It's Macau, which is right next door to Hong Kong. You can take a ferry to get there. It was a former Portuguese colony. So Portugal had also ceded its control over Macau. Macau is also a special administrative region. Anyway, this concept came into being under the declaration. What would happen as a result of this is that Hong Kong would return to Chinese sovereignty, but again under this special status of one country, two systems, which would allow Hong Kong to retain a, quote, high degree of autonomy, except in foreign and defense affairs. What one country, two systems means is that Hong Kong, which again, mind you, was a British colony from 1842 all the way to 1997, was not self-governing, okay? After 1997 would be self-governing, but would have a separate executive, legislative, and judicial branch that would continue to follow all the laws that had been in force as a British colony pre-1997, that those laws would remain unchanged. The economic system, which again has its own currency, the Hong Kong dollar, separate banking system, separate finance system. It has world, leading capital markets and stock exchanges. All of that would remain unchanged. And in addition, the declaration stipulated continued protection for civil and political rights under existing international conventions, including things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, of association, travel, movement, freedom of religious belief, etc. I can say probably a little bit more about this, but one critical factor is that these terms would be built in to Hong Kong's new constitution, which is called the Basic Law, and that this one country, two systems concept would remain in force until 2047, in other words, for 50 years. We're still obviously in the middle of that period, just a little closer than we were in the past. However, Hong Kong continues to be governed under the one country, two systems principle. No doubt we'll talk more about elections and some of the reasons for the protest, and maybe then I can say a little bit more about what the joint declaration and the Basic Law say about Hong Kong's governance structure. But I think that gets us pretty close to the present, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, of course. Now that was a great background and an awesome transition into one of my next questions. So can you explain the reason why the protests that occurred in the summer of 2019 and still this summer in 2020, why those protests took place?
Right. So this is a question we could spend several weeks perhaps discussing. And if you know anyone from Hong Kong or mainland China for that matter, it's worth a conversation because any of you who are familiar with US politics will realize that we remain in a very polarized moment here. Just use that lens to view the polarization within Hong Kong society and camps that are considered pro-government or pro-mainland on the one hand and pro-democracy on the other. And you'll have a very good sense of the level of emotion and intense difference around these issues. But I think it's important to remember that protests are nothing new in China, in Hong Kong. And let me go back and talk about a little bit about the broader context of the protests, and then I'll answer your question about the 2019 protests in particular. So I think that's helpful. Again, the ability to protest is enshrined in the law of Hong Kong, and like the US, Hong Kong has local ordinances and rules that govern how and where you can protest. And it has a permit system and things like that. And those systems have generally been relied on by the pro-democracy protesters for over a decade to bring attention to various issues. And some of these happen every single year on various holidays, like the June 4th holiday, which is a commemoration of events in Tiananmen in 1989. Then we also have protests that tend to arise around the mainland's National Day, which is October 1st. So every once in a while, there are kind of recurring protest moments. In 2003, there was an attempt in Hong Kong to pass a National Security Act, not unlike the one that was recently passed, and there was a protest, a very strong protest against that. It was shelved. 2014, some of you may remember something called the Umbrella Movement or the Occupy Central protests, which called for direct democratic elections for Hong Kong's government. That was a pretty big turning point in the protest movement. I can say more about that if you want. But most recently, in June of last year, there was an effort to introduce an extradition bill, which would have provided that criminal suspects that were in Hong Kong could be extradited to Taiwan, Macau, and the mainland. And that was precipitated by a murder that happened. And the murderer was a Hong Kong national, or alleged murderer was a Hong Kong national, or a resident, I should say, and fled to Taiwan. And so it raised this issue of whether there was a capacity for that resident of Hong Kong to be returned or to perhaps face prosecution in the mainland. And it caused this broader dispute and again brought these protests to light. But that was really only the start of it, because what those protests brought to light, and again, the initial protest against the extradition bill brought to the streets, by some counts, 1 to 2 million people, by other counts, 500,000 people. But this is a significant percentage of the Hong Kong population, which is 7.5 million. That was followed by other demands by the protesters, because these protests, for those of you who watch them on the news, became quite violent, took over much of the central business district on Hong Kong Island, that's Central and Admiralty. There were incidents involving a number of universities, which were effectively under siege for some part. There were barricades of most of the major highways at various points, and this went on all the way until the fall. And then there were additional protests that erupted around October 1st, again, National Day in the mainland, and continuing all through until the end of last year, and then all the way until the summer of this year as well. And so the initial impetus was this extradition bill that it was feared would allow for criminal defendants to be prosecuted in the mainland. But there were 5 other demands from the pro-democracy movement that emerged, and I can say more about those if that's of interest.
Yes, of course. That was actually my next question. Like, if you could touch on what the exact demands are from these pro-democracy protests, and if you think these demands can be fulfilled sometime in the future.
Yeah, so I should mention that the first demand was that the extradition bill be withdrawn. Initially, in kind of around the time that COVID erupted here, and my recollection was it was around April of last year, was when the extradition bill was proposed. And in response to these initial protests, Carrie Lam, who's the chief executive of Hong Kong, eventually, after some time had passed, agreed to suspend it indefinitely. And that was obviously not satisfactory because of concerns that it could be then reintroduced at any time. Finally, the Hong Kong government withdrew that bill entirely in September, but that was the first of the demands of the pro-democracy movement and the protesters. I'll list the other 4 here. The second one then was for the protest not to be characterized as a, quote, riot. Secondly, that there would be amnesty granted for those protesters who had been arrested, and I think recent numbers that I've seen is around 10,000. The third is that there'd be an independent inquiry into police brutality. The fourth was that there would be an implementation of complete universal suffrage, which, as you may recall, was one of the causes I mentioned of the protests in 2014, which are known as the Umbrella Movement. You can also see that that list is a pretty broad range, some of which are fairly easy to achieve if you're on the other side, and some of which are probably impossible to achieve, certainly on short notice, and in the face of the very polarized political environment in Hong Kong.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I definitely, let's chat more about the protests. And I also do want to touch on, the recent security law that President Xi Jinping passed this summer that eliminated some of Hong Kong's autonomy. What are the implications of this new law, and how does it affect the future of Hong Kong?
That's an excellent question, and I have definitely some things to say about that. But I think it might be helpful here to think about, well, why was this law passed in the first place, and give a little bit of context for it. And I think I want to say a couple more things about from the kind of Hong Kong standpoint that maybe help explain as well the protest movement and why there's a divide in terms of perceptions on the mainland and perceptions in Hong Kong. And I again, anyone you talk to will have their own view on these things, whether they're from the mainland, from Hong Kong, from elsewhere in the region, or from here for that matter. But I will say that one of the big reasons for the protests that I haven't talked about already is that there are some wings of the pro-democracy movement that have advocated for Hong Kong to become completely independent of China. And based on what I gave you in the kind of historical background, you'll know that there's an existing legal commitment and an existing recognition that in terms of territory, Hong Kong is part of China. And that was a part of the British agreement in 1997, was to cede territorial sovereignty over Hong Kong to mainland China, again, for this period of 50 years. And then thereafter, Hong Kong would return to complete Chinese sovereignty. So there's kind of a sunset on the one country, two systems. There has always been a small pro-independence movement within Hong Kong, but it has always been a very small part, even of the pro-democracy movement, and is not represented in any sense a majority, at least in my understanding, of the views of those in Hong Kong. Obviously, support, or maybe it's not so obvious, but support for the independence argument and the independence wing of the pro-democracy movement has increased as the context and policies within mainland China that apply only to mainland China have become much more authoritarian, much more controlling in terms of censorship, and have reverted to a more conservative place compared to, and conservative in the Chinese sense, compared to the administrations that preceded the current one under Xi Jinping. And so as the citizens in Hong Kong have watched this, they've become increasingly nervous, increasingly concerned. And I wouldn't say everyone, but again, those that are supported by the protest movements have become quite fearful about their future under an administration that's increasingly demonstrated an authoritarian bent. And there have been also certain incidents over time that I haven't had a chance to talk about that have increased those fears. From the mainland standpoint, however, watching from across the border, what is seen in going on in Hong Kong is a movement for secession. The independence movement is seen as a direct threat to China's territorial sovereignty and integrity. And there is a strong sense within the central government and among China's leaders that the protest movement is being driven by foreign elements, including those stirring up dissent and chaos from outside, whether that's from the US or Britain or elsewhere. There's this sense that there's foreign elements that are behind this, and that but for those foreign elements, Hong Kong would be peaceful and one country, two systems would proceed as planned. There's a sense that there's an element of terrorism involved because of the level of violence that occurred in 2019. I will mention that on October of last year, which is again a continuation but an escalation of the protests of 2019, there was a lot of violence that happened on a single day. There was again a barricade at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. A protester was shot by police, and a person was set on fire by some of the protesters. So there's been a lot of violence on both sides to a degree never seen before in Hong Kong. Very troubling to many within Hong Kong to see that level of violence. I'm not going to speak to whose fault it is. It is a consequence of the tensions and how heightened they are. I think we from the US can understand that, having experienced some of this in our own country. But that's the backdrop to the national security law. So to get to your question, on July 1st, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, which is China's legislature, adopted the national security law. Now, the national security law applies only to Hong Kong, and the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, again, the legislative body, does have status under the basic law, the Constitution of Hong Kong, to interpret the basic law, basically to interpret the Hong Kong Constitution. And so it's under that authority that this law has been brought forth. I should also kind of make mention, I have a copy of it right here. And it's also relates again to this concept of national defense and foreign affairs that under the basic law. So what it does basically is it provides criminal penalties for anyone that's advocating secession, in other words, independence, subversion, or terrorism, and anything that would be organizing, funding, or supporting any of those crimes. It also applies extraterritorially, meaning that it applies outside of Hong Kong. So it applies to everyone who's within the territory of Hong Kong. It also applies to both Hong Kong and foreign nationals who are outside the territory of Hong Kong, but who might be aiding and assisting or encouraging any of these activities. I can say a little bit more about recent developments under the national security law, but I think everyone listening can probably see readily how instituting criminal penalties for something that would include advocacy, for example, of Hong Kong independence, at the one end all the way up to support for protests and pro-democracy demonstrations on the other. It's unclear how some of this will be interpreted, and the fact that it is unclear has made many in Hong Kong very fearful to continue pro-democracy protests and activities.
Of course, and that was incredibly thorough. And I do kind of want to touch on, how COVID-19 and everything, public health wise has affected the region's fight for democracy. And if you would like to continue talking about the security law, absolutely feel free to touch on that. But I also do kind of want to gauge how you think COVID-19 has affected the region as well.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I should just point out that Hong Kong and many other places in East Asia, including South Korea, including Taiwan, including the mainland itself, have done a much better job, in my view, and in the view of many, and probably objectively, in terms of keeping down cases. I just note that there was the post or headline about Hong Kong being worried because of 23 new cases, I think, in the recent days or something. Hong Kong has only had a total of like 5,000 cases ever, and only 108 deaths compared to like 24,000 in deaths in New York City, and 1,600 cases in New York City yesterday. So just numbers wise, to compare kind of apples to apples, which I think is fair there. Hong Kong's doing a great job, even though it is now experiencing renewed concerns about COVID and its inability to kind of keep a handle on things. Hong Kong, since the pandemic started, has been very actively embracing things like contact tracing, quarantines, school openings under very protective conditions, et cetera, and also mask ordinances and things like that. I will note that in October of last year, Hong Kong introduced a ban on masks. This is pre kind of COVID measures because of the protests. But then in the spring, of course, had to step back from that because of the public health needs. So there's a little bit of a kind of a back and forth there on masks. But Hong Kong, of course, continues now, as most of East Asia does, under consistent mask practices. So that's kind of one kind of practical thing. In terms of the direct impact of COVID on the protest movement, obviously bringing crowds together is more challenging. But I think so in terms of, maybe a public health effect on protests, maybe there's an element there. But to be honest, the pandemic precedes the summer of this year, in which we saw wide-scale protests, again with masking and in compliance with these public health guidelines. But there's a lot of ways in which people can exercise voice. What has really disrupted visible large-scale protest activity has been the national security law. And an example of that was permits for an October 1st protest were denied on grounds of COVID, but again, many view there also to be national security reasons why the Hong Kong government was unwilling to grant a permit for October 1st protests for this year. Oh, I should say, let me just not interrupt. I almost left off an extremely important element of this. You asked me about protests, but another big thing is that elections for Hong Kong's legislature were slated for this fall, and those have been postponed till next September. Again, ostensibly because of the pandemic, but certainly critics have voiced strong concerns that this is an effort to impede democratic elections and using COVID as an excuse for that. I don't present a view on either of those positions, but those are kind of the two views on that.
Absolutely. And before we get into kind of another topic that I want to touch on, was there anything else regarding the national security law that you wanted to share before we kind of move on? Any other takes you have on that?
I think I'd like to make 2 points, and I don't know if a further question, I think we might have a further question coming up regarding the US response to all of this. And if so,
Yes.
I'll keep that point for later. But one important point is that there actually have been several arrests under the national security law. And one of those involved an individual who allegedly ran a motorcycle into a group of police while bearing on his motorcycle a banner with a slogan that is considered within the mainland as inciting people to commit secession. So therefore, the banner was allegedly in violation of the national security law. So that individual has come up on what's known as a bail hearing. It's a very early part of the criminal process. And so there has been a determination by the High Court in Hong Kong on that bail hearing determination, which was basically not to grant bail. But in the process, the judge took the opportunity to reemphasize the rule of law, importance of the rule of law in Hong Kong, and the importance of the national security law continuing to be interpreted and applied going forward in a manner that's consistent with one country, two systems, the rule of law in China, in Hong Kong rather, and the International Conventions on Civil and Political Rights, which as a matter of Hong Kong's constitution should apply within the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region.
Of course. And my next question was about the U.S. and kind of not necessarily our role, but kind of how our relationship with Hong Kong or mainland China, has kind of played out over the last few years.
Right. So there's a lot to say here. I think what I will say just briefly is that there has been a dramatic change in the U.S. position on the status of Hong Kong in light of the developments that we've been talking about today. The U.S. State Department in May, so this is before the summer protests and before the introduction of the national security law, post-pandemic, post-start of the pandemic. I wish I could say post-pandemic, but anyway,
right.
Back in late May, Secretary of State Pompeo announced that the State Department no longer considered Hong Kong to have significant autonomy from the mainland government, and expressed very strong concern later in the summer over the protests and the announced plans for the national security law. Once the national security law was passed, President Trump signed into effect something called the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and that was on July 14th, so only a week or so after the July 4th adoption of the national security law. And the Hong Kong Autonomy Act basically states that the U.S. no longer regards Hong Kong as being separate from the mainland, and this has some potentially very significant consequences for one country, two systems from the US perspective, and on the ability of Hong Kong to maintain its status as an international financial center. Because what this means is that any sanctions that the US might be inclined to implement against mainland China now could be applied to Hong Kong in the same way, without treating Hong Kong, as the US has historically done, as a separate democratic system with independent judges, with an independent economy, with an independent financial system. We have basically said, in essence, that we agree with the mainland. If you think that China, the Chinese central government is taking this position, in essence, our government appears to have backed away from its recognition of one country, two systems. But again, we're saying that we're doing that because of the protests and because of concerns about human rights in Hong Kong.
Sure. Can you speak to the role sports like the NBA and other professional athletes have played in the fight for democracy in Hong Kong?
Yes, so I think probably one of the most obvious of these things, which some of you may be familiar with, but let me just back up by saying that Western sports in China, and including Hong Kong and other East Asian countries in the region, U.S. and Western sports is a big deal. So we have, European football, not U.S. football, but soccer. We also have the NBA, which is huge in the mainland and has historically been huge. Some of you may know that one of probably China's most famous basketball player, Yao Ming, played for the Houston Rockets, and it is the Houston Rockets that came into the news last year in October while all of this was going on in Hong Kong, because its general manager, Daryl Morey, had tweeted and then quickly deleted a post supporting the protest in Hong Kong. This happened very early in the month of October. It generated an immediate response within China. The Chinese Basketball Association announced that it was suspending cooperation with the Houston Rockets. Then the Houston Rockets and the NBA later came out and made a statement that was not supportive of the tweet. It backed down and apologized for the tweet, condemning Morey's position on that. And then ultimately, again, the Chinese Basketball Association, which incidentally Yao Ming now leads, decided to cut ties not only to the Rockets, but has had implications for the NBA as a whole. State TV later in state by state, I mean the state controlled television station within China decided that it would cancel all broadcasts of NBA games in China, which is huge. All of us have experienced a little bit of that in the pandemic with our, favorite sports being curtailed in some sense. But this was a really big deal because this is in the fall at the, right before the start of the season, and was canceling preseason games. And the NBA has been effectively banned from television in China and has been, much maligned within the Chinese social media landscape for the past year. In preparation for this talk, I went online. Some of you can do this to find kind of what's the current state of play there, if I can make a pun. And it turns out that as of this past month in October, that there's been a reopening for the NBA to restart some activities within China. But this is a huge financial hit for the NBA and a disappointment, no doubt, to viewers in China, but a direct reaction because of this kind of personal support for events in Hong Kong. So that's kind of a direct tie-in, and there's probably other things we can say, but the NBA is a pretty big hit within the mainland, and so this is a pretty big deal.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you for touching on that. I do have a few more questions, so I want to say, anyone tuning in live, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Professor Ho, please feel free to start typing those into the chat function, and we'll be sure to try and get to your questions. So Professor Ho, another question for you. How has the role of social media kind of promulgated the unrest that we've seen in Hong Kong recently?
Well, I would say that social media in Hong Kong works pretty much like social media here. And to the extent that social media has been important in any of our protest movements, and some of you may have participated in such movements, you'll know how essential social media is in communicating and mobilizing and getting the word out. And we've just been through an election here, so social media has obviously been part of that process. And so much the same can be said about social media in Hong Kong, which is why the national security law prohibitions on communications that would be deemed to be advocating protests, particularly protests that might be seen to endorse independence or more extreme positions that are not acceptable to the mainland government, those kind of communications being effectively criminalized on Hong Kong social media, it is obviously a big change. And so, that's kind of the first point to make. Certainly social media, and maybe this is something that is obvious to me, but not obvious to some of your listeners, which is that social media in Hong Kong is indeed very much like the US in terms of the kinds of platforms, the types of internet sites you can access. It's not censored. Mainland internet content is censored. And if you were to go there, you would find that certain apps you have don't work suddenly. You can't Google everything. You can do that in Hong Kong. And so that remains the case, again, because of one country, two systems. But there is concern that use of social media to facilitate what might be deemed to be now a violation of this national security law could be problematic. So social media is a big part of protests anywhere, I think, and there as well as here.
Of course, of course. And I now want to talk, recently about the events that occurred this past Wednesday and kind of the implications of what occurred. And I'd like for you to share whatever you'd like about the recent events that have occurred this week.
Right. So this is not the first time that we've seen Hong Kong legislators disqualified. In fact, in July, Hong Kong disqualified 12 opposition candidates from running in the legislative elections. The Hong Kong government's position was that these candidates had colluded with foreign forces and also were in opposition to the national security law. And so this is kind of a continuation of some of those developments. It is concerning because what caused this to happen, again, is that the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, which does, again, have interpretive authority over Hong Kong's constitution, but has stated that legislators need to adhere to a patriotism, to be patriotic. And the definition of patriotism includes, I have a definition here of this that I wrote down, and I don't want to get it wrong, but most of you can probably Google and figure this out. But in any event, the definition of patriotism would not include advocacy for example, a pro-independence position. And so because 4 of these already seated legislators had previously advocated for positions that are deemed by the Hong Kong government to be in violation of the national security law, they were as soon as this mainland resolution was passed by the Standing Committee, within a very short period of time, these 4 sitting legislators had been disqualified because of not complying with those that resolution on patriotism, and then that caused the remaining block of pro-democracy legislators to say we're stepping down in solidarity as a bloc. And so this is fairly significant. Again, it probably represents one of the most direct statements that we've seen from China's legislature that has direct political implications visibly on the way in which Hong Kong's political system operates. And it's not the first, again, but it's the most significant and the most visible, and it's obviously drawn strong international reaction.
Mm-hmm. Of course. We do have an audience question, and I do have a few more, but any audience members continue to send in your questions. So Hunter asks, I'm doing research in China's economy for a class, specifically whether the data is accurate. Do you have any general advice or any sources to recommend on that research?
Can you repeat again, what's the specific topic?
Yes, of course. So Hunter asks, I'm doing research on China's economy for a class, specifically whether the data is accurate. And he's curious if you have any advice or any general sources to recommend.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is I'll just encourage Hunter to reach out to me separately offline of this conversation, and that's probably the best way for me to provide specific recommendations. We have some amazing resources here within the US, and there's also some online resources available through KU, which has an amazing ability to give us access to data from the mainland and lots of other places in the world. But we have a great East Asian collection, a great East Asian librarian, and so there's some great resources that we can access here. And there's also, again, a lot of excellent work being done by US analysts to kind of crunch numbers on the Chinese economy. And so that data is available. I think the broader question is, can we trust data coming out of China? And I think this is a really important question. The understanding that I think most of us who study China have, and I think this would be true of economists as well, and those who are looking at GDP numbers, for example, and things like that, which we continue to do and we must do on a regular basis, is that the important way to look at some of the data, particularly economic data, is to look at trends and to look at changes over time, as opposed to honing in on the details of some of the specific numbers. Now, you have to use that data, you have to use those numbers, but recognizing what are some of the limitations of the data. But again, when you look at the overall trends, those are reliable because they represent trends that can be compared to past periods. And then you can kind of look ahead and think about what the future might be like as well. And so from at a kind of higher level, these are numbers that are relied on internationally. I mean, we look at analysts from the World Bank to other international organizations. This data is what's there. That's not to say that there's not questions or concerns in some cases about the reliability of some data. And there's certain data that is considered highly sensitive and classified within China that if we had it might shed light on the situation in a different way. And certainly that's been something that's been much discussed in light of the pandemic. What do we know about COVID within China, China's response, those kind of things. But looking at the high level, broader trends and changes over time, we can get a pretty good sense, I think, of the situation, particularly with regard to economic data.
Of course. And Hunter, if you need Professor Ho's email, we can definitely get that to you after the program. I do have another question for you. So some protesters perhaps think that some American companies like Disney, Nike, and Apple with particularly strong ties to China have perhaps aided and abetted the Chinese government. Do you think this is an accurate assumption, or do you have any takes on this kind of question?
I think this is an excellent question, but it points to the very real difficulty that I think all my multinational companies are facing at the present time. The NBA example is kind of one instance of an industry that was pretty severely impacted by not even the industry or not even the company or an entity within, it's not the NBA itself that was making the statement, but individuals affiliated or in some way with, in this case, the NBA. But any major company that you can think of that has for a long time had or may still have either a lot of customers in China or maybe manufacturing in China, doing business in China in some respect. And I think it's helpful to mention here that this is a pretty big swath of the US economy, because most of you know that made in China is pretty much everywhere on our stuff, and there's a reason for that. And because we have benefited as an economy from longstanding ties with China, and our companies have been very helpful in China's move toward a market economy over the past 4 decades or more. And so we have been, our economies are very much entwined. And so we need to think carefully about whether we institute a cancel culture with respect to companies that have contact with China, recognizing that the Chinese government is doing the same thing, but from a more top-down perspective. So again, what happened with the NBA is an example of the Chinese government kind of canceling the NBA, and literally and figuratively for about a year. So we have pressures on both sides. So from the US side, I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't encourage our companies to represent our best values and to speak in support of human rights. But we need to recognize that our companies are caught in a very difficult space. And maybe this is a discussion that needs to happen not at the company or consumer level so much with diplomatic relations and negotiations between our two governments, because these are very live issues, and our two countries have very different values. And how we can proceed going forward is a really big question, and it will be a big question as in the next 4 years.
Of course. We do have another audience question. Isaac asks, are Hong Kong, and I will pronounce this incorrectly, Guangzhou, threatened by, okay, yes, you know what I'm saying, as long as you know. Are those two regions threatened by climate change, and what mitigation factors are they considering?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I will just say that any city of any size, and there are many within our own borders, obviously, coastal areas, some of you may be from California or Florida, all of these places that border any body of water are going to be seeing sea level rises and have arguably already seen measurable sea level rises as a result of climate change. And so climate change is impacting every nation now, every part of the world now, some more than others. And obviously those parts of the world that are in kind of relatively low-lying areas are going to be impacted more. Singapore is an example of that. Hong Kong is an example of that. Guangdong province, which it borders, again, is the southern border of China, which adjoins Hong Kong, will be impacted much as many other areas in mainland China, and the US will be impacted. And China has taken steps to combat climate change. You may remember that President Obama and President Xi were among the two signatories, among many, to the Paris Climate Accord. President Trump removed the US from that accord. We'll see what happens in the future, whether the US rejoins that. But since the start of Paris and really before, the mainland Chinese government has been a leader internationally in engaging around climate change responses. With regard to the region that Hong Kong is a part of, it's called the Greater Bay Area. There is an initiative within mainland China to help more directly unify the economies of what is called the Greater Bay Area. Again, that's Hong Kong and then the adjoining regions of the southern tip of Guangdong province. That entire area is also a focus with respect to climate responses, kind of greening and sustainability generally. And so there are some measures that are being taken. I think one of the most important is to be looking at there's a whole range of responses. China has a carbon tax. Whether that extends to whether it extends to Hong Kong, I don't know. Again, Hong Kong is under its own separate system and may join on to some of these initiatives. There are some sustainable finance initiatives that I've been looking at recently, which is how to green the financial system, which Hong Kong is a financial center. Shenzhen, which is the mainland Chinese city right across the border from Hong Kong, has been active in those initiatives as well. So we're starting to see developments in the finance sector, as well as what you might think is more traditional environmental measures and things like that that are being taken to mitigate environmental harms, but also climate change more broadly. So that's absolutely a big topic.
Yeah, and a very important question. So thank you, Isaac, for asking that. Olivia asks, do we know yet how President-elect Biden's approach to international relations with Hong Kong will differ from the current administration's?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic, and it's one that there's actually been a lot of speculation on in recent months, and there's been a lot of talks and panels and things like that online around this subject. So no doubt, if you wish, you can find many of those. I will highlight that this week and next, actually, the National Committee on US-China Relations has been doing a series of online, what we call China town halls that are open to the public. The biggest one, which has historically been held every year in October, was held this past Tuesday. There's another piece of that program on environment and health, which is focused on the exact question of, are there areas in which the US and China can cooperate, such as climate change responses, such as COVID responses, even though we have very significant differences on many other policy issues. And I think that program, if memory serves, is coming up next week, and anyone can register. So just go to the National Committee website and you can register and listen in on some of those commentaries. But I think the general view is that we should not expect a dramatic shift in US-China relations under a Biden administration. That said, Biden is someone who has been in public service for a long time and has had direct kind of frontline opportunities to be part of watching China open to the outside world since 1979. He has been in public life and has been directly involved in US-China relations to some extent throughout much of his career, and I think will be well positioned to engage with the Chinese leadership on issues of shared concern. I will note to our listeners that over the past year, not only has 2020 been crazy in many other ways, but US-China relations have been in a steady downward slide since at least 2018, when the US-China trade war got started in earnest. But this year, almost every week, every month, there seems to be one new incident that has worsened US-China relations. And some of you may know we have each closed consulates. That's a pretty big deal. I could say much more about all of that, but we are at one of the lowest points in US-China relations, and so there's certainly room to think about how to improve our relationship going forward so that we can engage on tough issues, whether that's human rights, whether that's trade. I do think it's an open question whether the trade tariffs that have been introduced under the Trump administration will persist and in what form, or if the Biden administration will take a different tack in dealing with some of the concerns that all of US administrations have struggled with, and in some cases for many years. So I don't think we'll see a complete shift. I do think we may see a shift in tone and maybe a shift in a greater emphasis on diplomatic solutions rather than kind of the trade tariff solutions that we've seen recently. But it remains to be seen.
Of course. Yes, of course. Well, I would like to ask you one more question and then let you close with any remarks that you'd like to share. How long is the road to democracy for Hong Kong, and is it possible in the near future?
That's another excellent question. I think if you had asked me this question at this time last year, we would have been in the middle of watching the protests unfold and protests that had become increasingly violent on both sides. That was a time of great sadness for me personally, because this is a place that I love very much. I have family there, I have colleagues there, I spend a lot of time there. And so it was very difficult to watch. But again, if I had been sitting here last year, I think I would have spoken with a bit more optimism about the ability of both China and the local government in Hong Kong to make one country, two systems work. I would have said something like one country, two systems is there, it's persisting, and in fact, we're seeing democracy in action. One reason that I might have said that is because the legislative elections last year resulted in almost a landslide they did result in a landslide for pro-democracy seats in Hong Kong's legislature. And that was seen by many, I think, as an endorsement of the political position of the pro-democracy movement, even if many disagreed very strongly with its methods, and many in Hong Kong remain concerned about the way in which the protest movement has proceeded. So again, views on both sides, but again, democracy was working, and it's faltering, it's messy, it's not perfect. There's a lot that's constrained about it, but we have been seeing steps toward democracy. And again, full universal suffrage is not a reality in Hong Kong. It's something that is part of the aspirations of the Basic Law. But at that time, I would have said that there could be a path to see that happen, if not immediately as the protesters were demanding, but maybe sometime down the road. Maybe others would say I'm completely naive about that, and that's not something the mainland government would have permitted under any circumstance. But certainly in the aftermath of the national security law and events of this week, it's very hard to see how one country, two systems will be able to persist in the manner in which it was first envisioned. And so this is something that I'm very saddened by, and we'll have to, again, stay tuned.
Of course. Well, those are all the questions I have. If you would like to share any closing remarks, you are more than welcome to do so. Otherwise, I have a few closing remarks, so I'll give the floor over to you in case you'd like to share anything else.
Thank you, Ashley. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I hope it's been helpful and interesting to those of you who are listening online. I think what I would just say here is that events in Hong Kong are but one piece of the broader picture of US-China relations. And because both the US and China are the biggest, not only the biggest economies in the world at this point, but are the two biggest players geopolitically, our relationship matters, and it matters in ways that you may not even anticipate it. And so I think it's very important that all of us seek to educate ourselves a little bit more on what's going on in China, whether that's Hong Kong, whether that's other regions within China, whether it's economics, whether it's trade, whether it's politics, whatever. China is not going away. China is going to take its own course. And like the US, as we became a world leader, China is feeling its way as a very important country that is taking leadership in some very important international arenas as well. And that's going to create some tensions, obviously, for the US and some challenges. And we are going to be in an era of friction and working things out, even as China is trying to figure out what does it mean to be a leader on the international stage. So even under the best of times, that would be some, a season of growing pains. We're not in the best of times right now. And we certainly are facing an administration on the Chinese side that is not committed to a liberal political reform in the way that maybe we hoped prior administrations would have been. That's not something that appears to be on the horizon within the mainland. And so that obviously has direct implications, not only for Hong Kong, but also for our government. And so I strongly encourage any of you who are interested in any of these issues, or maybe are concerned about some of the issues we've raised here, to educate yourself. And any of you who are remotely interested in studying Chinese, I still strongly encourage it. We need as many experts on China as we can get at this point in time. And it's a fascinating country and a fascinating place. And Hong Kong remains one of the most amazing places in the world. And I hope that some of you will have a chance to see it in better times and to enjoy, tourism and food and all kind of amazing things there at some time in the future. But really appreciate the conversation and the excellent questions, and look forward to perhaps hearing from some of you.
Of course. Well, fantastic. What an excellent event. I know I learned a lot. So thank you so much, Professor Ho, for taking time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise. It was really an awesome program. So thank you. And now the winner we're actually doing two winners today of our free pizza coupon is Matthew Johnstone and Isaac Allred. So we will be sure to reach out to both of you and get your contact information so we can share your prize with you. So congratulations and thank you for tuning in. I also want to share that our last program of the semester, we are hoping to schedule it for Friday, December 4th, and we want to chat a bit about Senator Dole's fight for animal welfare. Program logistics are still in the works, so we will be sure to share those with you all as we get closer to that event. But thank you all for tuning in today. We appreciate your time and hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.